When we think about World War II, we usually think about these epic stories of bravery, brilliant strategies, and titanic battles out on the open ocean. But this is a completely different story. It's a story about a war that, you could argue, was already decided long before the first shot was ever fired. A war that wasn't really won by soldiers, but by spreadsheets. Not by admirals, but by assembly lines. And it all begins with one man, a captain, witnessing something he just couldn't believe.
I want you to just imagine this for a second. You're one of the most experienced naval captains in the entire Japanese Navy. It is pitch black in the middle of the South Pacific, and your ship is ambushed. But what you're seeing, it isn't a battle. It doesn't make any sense. It's something else, something impossible. Those are the words Captain Tameichi Hara wrote down, just trying to process this horrifying new reality. And that one single observation, it holds the key to understanding the entire Pacific War.
So let's go there. We're in Iron Bottom Sound, right off the coast of Guadalcanal. It's November 1942. Captain Hara is standing on the bridge of his destroyer, the Amatsukaze. And all around him, American shells are exploding in what he could only describe as a volcanic eruption of steel and fire. It completely defied every single rule of military logic he had ever been taught.
Now let that sink in for a moment. In just 35 seconds, less than a minute, a single American ship fired off more ammunition than a Japanese ship like his was meant to carefully ration for an entire multi-day mission. The Americans weren't just fighting a battle. They were literally creating walls of fire in the ocean, turning the dead of night into broad daylight, their gun barrels glowing cherry red from the heat.
And Hara's terrifying experience, it wasn't some fluke. It wasn't an isolated incident. 6 months before this, all the way back at the Battle of the Coral Sea, another officer, Commander Naito, sent a report back to Tokyo that must have sounded like pure fantasy. He reported seeing American ships just keep firing their anti-aircraft guns for 4 hours straight. 4 hours! Without ever seeming to worry about running out. A pattern was starting to emerge, and for the Japanese High Command, it was a deeply, deeply unsettling one. To really understand why this was so shocking, you have to get inside their heads. The entire Japanese military doctrine was built on one fundamental belief: ammunition is incredibly precious. Their gunners were drilled to be almost inhumanly disciplined. You hold your fire. You wait until the enemy is dangerously close. You fire in short, controlled bursts. You make every single shot count. Why? Because they assumed that every navy in the world had to operate under these same tight constraints. They were about to find out just how wrong they were.
So, these observations from the front lines, they weren't just tactical puzzles for captains to solve. No, they were the first chilling clues pointing to a much, much bigger problem, a strategic catastrophe that was already well underway. The war was turning into a math problem, and Japan was about to fail the test.
And here's Captain Hara again, this time from an earlier battle. He noted that the Allies' aim was actually pretty terrible, but their expenditure of shells was absolutely breathtaking. And this right here reveals a terrifying new way of fighting a war. See, you don't actually need to be a perfect shot if you can afford to make the entire sky a lethal place to be. This wasn't bad tactics on the Americans' part. It was a demonstration of unimaginable industrial wealth.
Let's look at the Battle of Savo Island. On paper, it was a brilliant, textbook Japanese victory. They sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers in about 33 minutes, an absolute masterpiece of naval combat. But here's the crazy part. It was a completely hollow victory. They sank the warships and then immediately turned around and left, not because they were afraid of planes, but because they had shot almost every single shell they had on board. They left the huge, slow, vulnerable American transport ships, the real prize, completely untouched because they literally could not afford the ammunition it would take to sink them.
The difference in scale just becomes almost tragic when you look at the supply situation. Japan was risking 8 of its most advanced destroyers in the famous Tokyo Express runs just to sneak a measly 280 drums of supplies to their starving soldiers on Guadalcanal. A single American destroyer in a routine firefight could burn through that entire desperate delivery in about 20 minutes. So the question is, where on earth was all of this American firepower coming from?
Well, the answer wasn't on any battlefield. It wasn't found in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It was in quiet towns like Hastings, Nebraska, and Crane, Indiana. To solve this mystery, we have to leave the front lines completely and go to the American home front, to the factory floor, because that's where this war was really being won.
47 billion. That is the number of bullets, just small arms rounds, that the United States produced during the war. One general actually did the math and figured out that was enough ammunition to shoot every single person on the planet at the time 10 times. It's a number so huge it almost stops making sense. It is the sound of an industrial giant finally waking up.
Okay, let's put these numbers side by side, because this is where it gets really insane. In a single peak month, the US was making 3.5 billion small arms rounds. Japan's peak, 4.5 million. For those big 5-inch naval shells that shocked Captain Hara so much, the US was churning out 1.2 million a month. Japan struggled to produce less than 10,000 shells of all naval sizes combined. This wasn't a gap, this was a canyon. But behind these numbers are people. These are human stories. In Japan, you have a 12-year-old girl, Akiko Sato, forced to work in an arsenal, pulling 12-hour shifts fueled by a single rice ball for lunch, literally collapsing from exhaustion at her machine. And then in America, you have Mary Roberts, working a comfortable 8-hour shift for good pay, getting hot meals in the cafeteria, and watching free movies with her friends on Friday nights. This wasn't just a war of armies, it was a war between two completely different industrial worlds.
And if you want to see what that difference looks like, here it is. For every single rifle bullet that Japan could manage to manufacture, the United States was pumping out over 3,000. Just think about that for a second. How can you possibly win a war against an enemy who has 3,100 times your output in something as basic as a bullet? The simple, brutal answer is, you can't.
So, let's take all of this staggering industrial power and plug it back into the front lines. What does it actually feel like to be on the receiving end of this? What's it like for a pilot to fly his plane right into the teeth of this productive machine?
This is how a Japanese pilot who was shot down and rescued described it: execution by machinery. He said it wasn't even a battle. The Americans weren't trying to aim at individual planes. They were just filling every single cubic meter of the sky with so much steel that they created these zones of death that were simply impossible to fly through. And this crippling ammunition shortage created a devastating death spiral for Japan. It was a vicious cycle. First, because every round was so precious, they had to hoard it for combat. That meant they couldn't possibly spare any for training, which, of course, led to inexperienced pilots and gunners who were way less effective in a real fight. And when your pilots and gunners can't hit anything, you have to resort to desperate final measures, like the kamikaze. It's the logical endpoint when the weapon is no longer the bullet, but the person carrying it. And the effect this had on training was just catastrophic. By 1944, a new Japanese pilot might get, if he was lucky, 60 hours of total flight time. For his entire gunnery practice, he would fire a grand total of 30 bullets. 30. His American opponent got over 400 hours in the cockpit and fired more than 5,000 rounds just in training. One of these men was a trained pilot, the other was just being thrown into the fire.
And if you want one detail that just captures the absolute depth of this resource crisis, this is it. To get the copper and tin they desperately needed for shell casings, the nation had to resort to melting down its own cultural heritage. 45,000 ancient Buddhist temple bells, some of which had been calling people to prayer for centuries, were taken down and thrown into the furnace.
And here's the tragic, brutal math of that sacrifice. A big temple bell might give you enough brass for maybe 2,000 shell casings. Well, a single anti-aircraft gun on an American destroyer could fire that many rounds in just 16 minutes. A piece of history, hundreds of years old, a part of a nation's soul, vanished in a 16-minute burst of machine gun fire. So what's the final verdict here? The point is this: the war in the Pacific wasn't just a fight between sailors at sea or soldiers in the jungle. At its core, it was a brutal contest of industrial power. The courage of the individual Japanese soldier was absolutely immense, nobody can deny that. But that courage was being thrown against an enemy who could bring an overwhelming, industrialized mechanical force to every single fight.
And in the end, who better to give us the final word than the man who saw this impossible reality from the very beginning? Captain Tameichi Hara, one of the only Japanese destroyer captains to actually survive the entire war. He summed it all up perfectly. He said it wasn't the American sailors or the admirals who beat him. It was their factories.
If you need just one last number to truly grasp the insurmountable scale of this difference, think about this. The amount of copper that the United States used only for making shell casings was more than 5 times Japan's total national consumption of copper for everything. For their military, for their industry, for civilian use, all of it combined. How do you even begin to compete with that? You just can't. And that leaves us with a pretty tough question to think about. We love to tell and celebrate stories of heroism, of courage, of sacrifice. and we should. But maybe the hard, cold lesson from this war of ammunition is that in our modern industrial age, victory might have less to do with the spirit of the warrior and more to do with the cold, hard math of production. It's a question that echoes all the way from the battlefields of the Pacific to the conflicts we see in the world today.